Hey there, I'm Doug. I wrote The Guardsman under the pen name of R.G. Taark. Today we are into episode number 35 of The Guardsman. This is book 3, Wrath and Retribution. We are on chapters 82 and 83 today. When you get a chance, please hit that like, subscribe, and share. We'd love to hear from you. If you would like to leave a comment, that would be great. If you're really interested, down at the bottom there should be a link to the book. Get yourself your own copy. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy. See you on the other side.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 35, Chapters 82 through 83. Chapter 82. The soothing sound of his overcoat's heavy hood over the steel masking helmet almost made up for the irritating lack of peripheral vision the thing restricted. The face of Christos was completely obscured by the restricting mask, and the deep shadows at the eye holes made retinal identification impossible from even the best and most sophisticated security cameras. Once the damn things were tied into the building security systems, their digital feeds could be nearly instantly analyzed and processed for key facial recognition traits. Keeping his head canted slightly down while deep in the shadows of the hood and mask his eyes were unrecognizable. There was not a camera ever invented that could see through steel and shadow to pick out the modest coloration changes of the eye's iris, since the usurpers to his rightful dominion had placed the absurd bounty of 10 million credits on his head. More than 1 in 10 of the hundreds of thousands of buildings and megastructures in his city had upgraded, repaired, or installed new security devices on all levels. Another quarter were under contract for the coming month's batch of new security devices, since the sudden wave first to install and upgrade systems had wiped out the planet's inventory, and this last month's production had gone directly into finishing those jobs. Those traitorous self-serving bastards in the buildings and production and security systems sales rackets were all colluding against him. When he reclaimed what was rightfully his, they would all pay extra for everything from the food their wretched little children ate to the power that lit their cramped dwellings. He'd known right away that statistically the odds of any one of those building owners or management agencies being able to cash in on those upgrades, should he be stupid enough to stumble into their security net, which was not going to happen, were something akin to winning a lottery jackpot. His randomly picking their building was a fractionally small chance. The only real winners were the security firms that were cashing in on his unjustified persecution. He could almost ignore the fools looking to win a lottery, though he never would ignore or forget them. They'd pay handsomely. He didn't know how yet, but they would. It was not a pressing issue at the moment as the 5 of them approached their destination. Those betraying merchants would all keep for his slow, patient blade and ultimate revenge. The fools upgraded their buildings' security systems, smelling the off chance of a substantial payday. Still, none of the insipid bastards bothered installing lights in the lower corridors beyond what was minimally required to keep them twilight lit, but out of complete darkness. Darkness served his purposes, but suffering it through the disinterest of others didn't please Casimir in the least. Casimir and Jellerman hated gathering all their primaries together like they were today, but this was important enough for them to take the risk. Not to mention the satisfaction associated with their meeting location and the wonderful nervous excitement associated with the thrill of this particularly gratifying hunt. They were going to knock down 2 birds with 1 stone. They'd hold their planning session and knock off some competition at the same time. Even with the size and wealth of his hobby organization, Casimir had never been able to truly dent the competition, let alone totally exterminate them as he'd hoped. His organization was still relatively young, small, and vibrant. It always amazed him what he could do with a few redirected professional intelligence assets in the sloppy and lazy criminal underworld. The annoying thought came to him that had that bloody idiot Uncle Philip allowed him to place a bounty on that whore. Cousin, none of this would be necessary. He could have rounded her up, killed that worthless whore and her bastard guard dog cleanly, and proceeded smoothly along his long-planned approaches. Casimir ruthlessly crushed that flare of anger and focused himself on his Christos persona. Foster was on point. His number 4 and tech man was followed by Morneau. Behind him were Gellerman, his number 2, and Meade, his number 5, as rear security. Their stack of 5 moved silently down the dank, stinking corridor at the second from the bottom level of their target building. At this hour, even the junkies and dealers were slipping off into their stupors. Stupors none of his 5 would ever enjoy. Had he ever made the mistake of harboring one so weak in his inner circle? They all had the top-end military nano-S that their bodies could support to sweep their systems clean of debilitating hallucinogens and euphoria chemicals. They worked doing that the same way they protected them from nerve, blood, and blister chemical agents, along with toxins and nefarious biological agents. Instead, the corners of Christo's eyes itched with the black sludge from the neutralized, packaged, and discarded chemicals. He could not scratch his eyes through the mask, even though number 4 had told him that there were no security devices on the floor whatsoever. There was always the off chance someone could have installed something after he checked, or some petty dealer with a healthy case of paranoia might install something like that on their own. And then would it not be ironic if some rival cartel's petty foot soldier and dealer got to cash in on his head because Christos got careless? Casimir pinched his eyes closed and rolled them around the insides of his lids through several rotations in both directions. He could feel the gunk under his lids and blink the watery mash away around his tear ducts and sclere on the outside of his eye. He could practically feel the black oozing out of his system and leaving gunky, sticky streaks down his cheeks. The thought pissed him off again, and he felt his anger spike to the point where he had to grind his teeth together, causing his jaw muscles to press against the insulated interior of the mask. The insulated interior was not just for comfort either. That layer was what trapped and cancelled any oddball waves that might be used to do things like sense his bone structure with something like an ultrasound, light rays, or some form of magnetics. Their overcoats and gloves were lined with the same stuff so that any snooping bastards could not map their muscular skeletal systems either. Seeing as Casimir's entire identifying medical and health profile was now public knowledge thanks to that festering whore who was tainting his office, anyone could identify his body through a myriad of different scans. The bitch used the pretext of banished outlaw status to violate him in a way no one in their lofty world would ever tolerate. Casimir felt his fists ball painfully against the leather gloves as his superheated anger spiked again. That bitch's goal, using his own office to not only stage her farcical ascension, but to publish his whole life's medical history and genetic markers down to the last nucleic acid. And then on top of that, the wretch had attached all that to the bounty on his head, like he was some common criminal. It was a travesty he would rectify brutally. She would suffer. He would just wait a little longer, remaining carefully patient. Number 4 pulled to the left a number of meters to his front. Christos slowed his pace as the surveillance tech expert stood to his toes and leaned forward into the wall across from a door. He pressed a molted black device up into the black mold and water-stained corner between the ceiling and wall opposite their target door. Number 3 pulled a slick little device from his own overcoat's outside pocket. Number 4 stepped back from the wall, facing back to back, and pulled a monitor console from his own pocket. He tapped the screen 3 times, cycling through the 3-way camera, looking down both directions of the hall, and at the door itself. When complete, he tapped number 3 on the back with his free hand. Number 3 pressed the device to the door and pressed a button. As Christos pressed his back to the wall several meters down from the door, numbers 2 and 5 pressed in next to him, shoulder to shoulder, while the breaching team did their work. Number 4 slipped in next to number 3 at the door. 3 watched through his thermal imaging device while 4 knelt partially, careful to keep his knees and overcoat off the swampy, slimy, and sticky floor as much as possible. Sure that the enemy were at their biological ebb, 3 tapped 4's shoulder with his left hand. 4 pressed a lock pop to the door's pathetically simplistic security, and with a minuscule click, the door was unlocked. A blink later, both men of the breaching team were through the door. Christos' back left the wall as he strode purposefully forward, with 2 and 5 on his heels. The less time they all spent loitering in the hallway, the better. The dank, stinking drug den reeked of mixed opiate and hallucinogenic smoke. Even the floor was sticky with the residue. Some of those had been around for thousands of years, and others were newly exotic concoctions with nothing but slum names. The only lights in the den were the flickering vidscreen with spider web cracks through its screen from the upper left, where something solid had shattered the matrix, and a few candles and lamps. The door was closed behind them as quickly as they entered. 3 and 5 made quick work of the den's nominal security as they failed to stir from their own stupors. Christos located his target immediately. The emaciated male with the rival gang dragon tattooed down the left side of his face lay reclined in the visibly sticky, discolored, and torn couch in front of the vid with his head back on a rumpled arm, spilling its stuffing below his right ear. 2 asked quietly as 4 fiddled with a piece of tech. "Any problems, 4?" 4 calmly responded, "No. The room's clean, no active or passive sensors." He tuned and adjusted his tool. "The only electronic signature into the room is through the vid screen, and minimal power draw for the lighting and appliance outlets. There's not even a comm unit power cell in here. Team, we're clear here." 2 acknowledged. "Understood. Get to work, everyone." Christos ignored the order. He knew it was not for him, but for the rest of the team to keep them moving crisply and preserve their op. 2 and 4 moved deftly to the crooked fold-out table in the efficiency kitchen and knocked everything with a single swipe onto the floor. The drug and roach-crawling food paraphernalia fell with a distracting clatter of spilled food tins, drug vials, and utensils marred with drug burns and old food residues. Christos cringed as he looked away from the utensils. The burn-marred surfaces with food residues meant the wastrels ate with the same utensils as they used to prepare their drugs. The prospect of eating the drugs and injecting the slop these creatures called food sent a disgusted shiver down his spine. The cluster of drug-wasted bodies stirred in their tangled mass on the bed surrounded by their candles, but remained undisturbed by the racket. They just slept through their stupors and their accustomed drug habits. Christos' eyes flicked back down to his target from the tangle of 1 male and 3 female addicts on the bed. In the dank dark, he could hardly tell which sex they were through their wasted bodies other than the cut and contents of their tattered and stained undergarments. His target's eyes, however, fluttered listlessly as his drug-addled brain struggled to claw its way to consciousness. Christos could see the eyes behind those lids sliding back and forth, unfocused in the dark and drugs. Shaking his head at the pathetic creature, he could not believe that this was such a wily and cagey mid-level competitor who'd caused so much trouble for his organization recently. This creature was a waste of space and nothing to be feared. He heard the artist's tube that number 2 had used to transport his map thump empty along the back wall, along with the rustle of thin paper. At the sound, Christos knew he had to be about his business. Christos drew the steel blade from his hip and crushed the open crook of his left hand, thumb up across the dealer's mouth. mashing his head back into the couch. He leaned casually across the prone body, and ignoring mildly shifting arms and legs, he carefully slotted the blade inside the left pec and slipped it between the third and fourth ribs. There was a quick convulsion at the entry, followed by a sudden surge of welling blood around the blade, flooding the stained and ragged once white t-shirt and couch. Christos sawed the blade back and forth at different angles, shredding the heart muscle with a surgically sharp serrated knife edge. The faster the thing could no longer beat and pump out more blood, the faster Christos could pull his knife out with less mess spilling everywhere to get on his overcoat. Why such a waste of a creature would bother clinging to life was just annoying. It should just hurry up and die so he could get about his business. There were more important things to do than wait for this insipid creature to finish. But Christos had to make sure it was done and done right. When Christos felt the last feeble twitch under his left hand and the last of the fading light and activity dimmed from the target's eyes, Christos wiped the spittle off the palm of his glove on the couch. Then, with a wet-sucking sound, he ripped his knife from the wound. Just for fun, he turned the blade in his wrist, cutting an even larger gash between the ribs, before wiping the blade on the couch. Task complete, he turned from the body and blood-sodden couch to see 3 and 5 adding doses to the incapacitated sleepers. They would not wake from their drug-induced coma during their discussions. 2 and 4 were quietly leaning over the map and talking in their own hushed tones. 2 slipped the empty tube back over his shoulders diagonally and cinched it tight so he would not forget it when they left. Christos kicked some ravaged food containers from the floor where he intended to place his feet at the nominal head of the tiny table. On his final step, he heard some piece of glass drug paraphernalia crack and snap under his boot sole. Ignoring it, he remembered his discretion, lied, and demanded, "First off, I want to cover what we don't want to do. How do we cause all the reactors to go critical and nova at the same time?" Jellerman looked up at Foster. The technical man had a better understanding of these things. Force shook his head at the difficulty of the task. "It's nearly impossible." He thumbed his security monitor to the side so he could watch the hallway, providing a warning if anyone approached on his deployed 3-screen device. The tool was currently filling a dual role as a paperweight on the schematic. Christos snapped his lie through the modulating mouth hole of his helmet. "Good. It's what we don't want to do. Now get on with it. I need to know what to avoid doing so we don't blow ourselves up in the process." If he had to burn this world to the ground behind him so they could not have it, he would do so without hesitation. There was no need to express that true feeling out loud, though. Foster reached deep into his own mask and pulled it side to side with his thumb and index finger in the eye holes, presumably scratching some eye itch that was bothering Christos. He replied simply, "Like I said, it's not easy. There are a number of fail-safes independently engineered into the system that would all need to be taken out at the same time. First, there are the physical limitations of plasma containment in an overheating reactor. Second, the reactors all have independently scripted digital decision matrices custom tailored to the design of the individual reactor they oversee. That means that they are immune to system viruses because they are not plugged into the common system like that, and any virus would need to be custom tailored for every independent reactor. Reporting requirements from substations and reactors are sent by networked monitoring devices that only read information from the reactors and do not have access or authority to alter the systems in any way. That means direct insertion of the program, altering each virus into the configuration for each system, and custom work for each one of those programmed systems on an intimate basis we will not have access to before we begin programming. Not to mention alterations are one of the reported criteria from reactor programs to networked monitors. they'd know at the speed of digital transmissions that unauthorized alterations were taking place before we could even upload the virus. Christos groused. Right. Systemic security. Move along. 4 continued. There is substantial personnel oversight at the facilities, and contracted security is heavy with checkpoints and reaction units in the building. Generally, they also maintain secondary security units on the outskirts ready to react with hegemony line troops on call should the facilities come under direct attack. Any one of those systems can trip the fail-safes manually or digitally. That will snap off the magnetic containment, and the pressure that heats the plasma will instantly snap off too, and the reaction will collapse. Christos replied bored. Understood. Fusion failsafes. The briefer continued. Correct. The only reactor that was ever allowed to go critical was not designed with mechanical or human fail-safes, and only the profit-minded regulation program. That happened because the program started feeding more and more into the reaction until it became self-sustaining and catastrophically burned through containment. Casimir didn't comment about the unneeded history lesson. Instead, he changed directions. What about selective brownouts? Gellerman answered this time, much easier. Foster agreed. Number 2 is correct, Christos. Casimir listened carefully as the various mechanical and electrical engineering flaws of the system from the Kroinos grid to the tower interfaces were listed in detail. 3 and 5 listened too while they worked preparing the den, so it looked like a simple drug turf war hit had wiped out the occupants. Given their 3 dispatched security, the primary target that Christos himself had dispatched, and the near-brain dead wastrels on the filthy bed, they had plenty of props available to provide a suitable setup for an accident that would cover their presence. When Morneau and Meade stopped shuffling around the den, the sweet smell of irritating spilled lamp oil cut burning into his eyes. It hit him about the same time as the 2 pulled up next to the map and stopped to listen to the remainder of their scouting report. When Foster wrapped up, Gellerman asked curiously, "You have a plan for this information, Christos?" Casimir nodded as he continued to stare at the map and work it over in his head. "Yes, I do. It's a little premature to discuss this in detail, but I think I have a way for us to make substantial inroads into reclaiming our rightful place, along with the opportunity to vastly enrich our organization at the expense of the enemy. We have a few loose ends to tie up first. One that has been particularly irritating to me personally over the last many months, with his incessant jaw flapping. After that, I think we can put our expendable hobby hoodlums to great use." He looked up from the map and around their assembled group. "I think that's all for now. Do we have any reason to stay in this cesspit any longer?" They all intoned, "No, sir." Casimir nodded. "Good. Finish here, and we'll be on our separate ways." He turned and saw why the reek of lamp oil was burning his eyes. Morneau or Meade had overturned some of the oil that was at the head of the mattress, allowing it to spill into and onto the mattress and its occupants, saturating them and the infectious pile they slept on. He glanced up at the fire detection and suppression systems, only to see that, as in almost every drug den they'd attacked or supervised, the system was bypassed and inoperable. There was a reason they were completely expendable. These wastes of space were too stupid to survive in the real world. They hid in their drug haze and intentionally made themselves stupider. They deserved no better than to be props used to cover Christo's Congress in the drug den. He stepped back from the map, and Meade stepped forward with a spray bottle of accelerant commonly used to heat many of the drugs these creatures prepared. He sprayed all over the map as the rest of them stepped back. Careful to avoid stepping in anything particularly unsavory, Christos navigated towards the door with his 2 through 4. Meade gingerly picked up the map with his left fingers so he could avoid as much of the accelerant as possible and dragged the now sodden map through the air to the sleeping addicts. Before he dropped the map, he misted the air all around and over the four. He dropped the map and let it drift over them like a blanket as he backed carefully to the head of the bed where there were candles burning on the wall-mounted headboard, and he knocked a few of them over onto the pile. Of course, they went out in the fall. He just wanted the excuse of candles falling to foil the inevitable fire investigators sent by the insurance company. He was forced to pluck one carefully from the wall and touch the flame to the map, which instantly burst into a flare of light. The comatose addicts lit as Meade backed away, spraying more accelerant down the side of the mattress and over to the couch. The stench of burning hair and flesh was accompanied by the faint drug-induced unconscious groans and newly crackling flames. He watched as the map flipped up over the heated updraft, sparked fiercely into flame as the thin accelerant-saturated paper was completely consumed into flaky gray ash, and Meade loosened the cap of his bottle and hurled it at the static-ridden vid-screen. It exploded in a shower of liquid accelerant that draped the whole quarter of the den, the staged bodies of the slain guards along the primary target. Meade was a master of chaos, and it was a constant joy on the rare occasions Christos got to watch his work. Christos calmly turned from the pyre and ordered, "Gentlemen, shall we depart?" as he pulled open the door and stepped casually into the hallway. He turned to his exit route and stepped off on a stroll until he heard the door close firmly behind the last of his men. He didn't even bother to look back. Foster would retrieve his camera, and all traces of their presence would disappear in the flames and chaos they'd left behind. Chapter 83. Samson got tired of waiting for her to wake up. He shut off the light over the room's desk. That same desk in their room that was now permanently covered with the mixture of his and her unclassified documents and the various signatures required irritants associated with both of their jobs. He'd finished 3 hours of work already sitting at the desk and done a 90-minute workout to start the day, after his usual 5 in the morning start. Persephone still lay on her side, in a crumpled mess, and face down on her pillow. Their calm alarms had gone off at exactly the same time that morning. He silenced his alarm with a single finger. He was already sitting up while she groaned in pain, slapping her hand around the dresser, knocking everything in 1,000 different directions before she found the annoying source of the racket. She'd pounded on it with her hand, frustrated and unable to stop the alarm. It finally went off by chance, and she tossed the device across the room in drunken frustration. He'd been standing watching the uncoordinated display when her comm had smashed into the far wall next to her closet and thumped lightly to the carpet when it had landed. He had not checked, but it sounded like she'd cracked the screen when she'd tossed it, and he'd heard several pieces rattle when it bounced. He rounded the bed from the desk and thumbed the blind control on the console behind her nightstand. The thumb switch depolarized millions of tiny flecks that floated in the thick armored glass, turning them from an impermeable light screen back into their natural clear. The morning sun lit the room in gloriously brilliant rays that shot straight in and bathed the room in light. Samson looked from the clear window that stretched from headboard to closet 20 paces away, and was taller than he was if he stood on the waist-height sill. Instead of fooling around with the various functions that would create different dividers and shapes like smaller windows or circular viewports, he just dumped power from the whole thing. It was suddenly like taking the roof off the building and living outside. Persephone didn't stir. Buried under her hair with her face mashed into the pillow, she didn't even notice. Samson snapped. "Wake up, you—" She groaned, pressed her face deeper into the pillow, and pulled her blankets tighter. Samson peeled back the blankets from her grasping hand and snapped, "Enough of this." He whacked her hard 3 times on her pink, snugly pant-clad thigh. "Wake up, you!" While she was still jerking, convulsively grasping for the blanket, his whacks landed and she suddenly jerked upward and shouted, "Oa!" That immediately turned into another groan as the light slammed into her eyes and ripped open her hangover. Muffled by the pillow, she pressed her face back into it and shouted, "I hate you. It's too early. Turn the lights off, you jerk." Samson just laughed at her and stepped back, ready for her fight or flight. He mocked her. "Early? Woman, it's past 9:30. Persephone shot up from the pillow shouting, "What?" Her feet slammed into the floor as she shouted, "Shit! Shit! Shit!" She tried to force her way off the bed with her hands, but wobbled as her world spun. She visibly swallowed her nausea. Stepping forward, Samson caught her shoulders, causing her to look up. He spoke calmly, "Don't worry. I made your excuses already. I signed your sick slip and got you a day off from school." Pissed off at him mocking her, she grumbled clearly, "I have stuff to do today. Damn it, Samson." Her head spun, and he could tell she was suffering as she groaned again and pressed her hands to her eyes. Needling her, he asked, "How's your hangover?" She rubbed her eyes and head as her headache pounded, and she moaned. "Go to hell, you jerk," she groaned. "Where's my detox patch?" Samson chuckled. "We didn't use them last night. Everybody needs a good hangover every once in a while to teach them humility." She growled, "I hate you." He watched her and could almost hear her head swim as she realized she was still drunk on top of the splitting headache, spinning world, and nausea she was already complaining about. He picked up the glass of water he'd poured for her hours before and set it on her nightstand for her, in one of the areas cleared by her hand flailing wake-up alarm response that morning. He knocked her forearm with it, gently drawing her attention. "Sip slowly. Let it sit on your tongue." She took it and sipped very gingerly. Samson droned unconcerned. "Don't feel too bad. Your mother spent the night retching. She's apparently been puking her guts out since she left dinner and has just now fallen to sleep. She'll be a wreck probably until tomorrow." She was sipping and moaning piteously into the water at the mention of puking. He could tell her head was pounding behind her clamped eyes and tangled hair. She complained bitterly, "Why can't Nanois filter alcohol too?" Samson stepped away as he fiddled with his calm, ordering a light breakfast. He answered while he wandered to the desk, "Because hangovers teach us humility and life would be no fun if we couldn't get hammered every once in a while. Designers are too smart to take away that much fun from us poor, pathetic, common human masses." He continued sarcastically, "There'd be riots in the streets if we couldn't get drunk anymore." She groaned into the glass that modulated her voice, and Samson was having fun since he could tell that returning her sarcasm was starting to get to her. "You said that humility crap before, jerk. I hate you and stupid nano designers too." He ignored her and casually tossed his calm onto the desk before reaching down to shuffle the papers he would carry for the day. "I ordered a little breakfast before we hit the road." She snapped, "I don't want any breakfast." But her body put that statement to lie with an audible stomach growl. He heard her fuss and kick behind him as he stacked thick folders. Then he heard her hand slap her own empty stomach. He was very glad they were facing opposite directions and she could not see him smiling at the desk. She protested into the glass after another sip, "I'm not going anywhere with you today. I hate you." He felt his head nod. "Yes, I'm sure." but you would have hated me more if I hadn't stopped that third bottle of wine from landing in front of you." He could tell by her voice she was suddenly more awake. "I didn't. I only had one," he asked with his back to her, still looking down at the desk and shuffling items for his paperwork satchel. "Which one of us has the hangover? There were 2 that you finished last night. I was counting. Your mother had nearly 4½ to herself, and Abigail shared with her into 2½ of her own. That would bring the total between the 2 of them to 7 bottles. Your mother took the lion's share, though." He heard the rustling of sheets and a groan before the soft sound of her head falling back into the pillow. Her voice was slightly pillow-muffled. "I'm never drinking again, ever." He let her lay. She still had the glass cradled in her hands, but it was nearly empty. He checked the tabs and made a careful side note of what was going into his bag, for Grant's document accountability, before he jammed the hand's height of paperwork into his satchel. With his bag packed, he turned, strolled around the bed, and plucked the glass from her fingers. He refilled it most of the way and returned it to her hands just before the ping on the door announced the arrival of breakfast. She flailed, grumbled, and groused about not wanting to eat. But after her first bite of non-acidic sliced fresh fruit and a breakfast roll, she quieted down and actually sat up to eat and sip her water as she pecked at the good-sized tray of food. Getting her dressed and out the door was another matter. That didn't happen until just before noon. He did know her well enough to guess that time fairly accurately, which meant he did not have to reschedule the dropship they'd be taking for the trip. Persephone sat next to him at the front of the ship's forward bulkhead, just behind the flight deck, and dozed peacefully against his shoulder as they flew. This time they were escorted by a completely different Home Guard security squad, sitting ducks in a row across from him. Samson figured that they would also be hoping for the off chance that he'd find them a war to fight or someone to shoot. Persephone's 2 guardsmen sat at the back of the drop ship, chatting bored between themselves by the ramp on their unlisted flight. Even if the flight was unlisted, they were being tracked in detail by Warsong's Overwatch cannon in shallow geosynchronous orbit looking for any threats. When they touched down on the pad at the top of the building that housed the Guardsman Academy, they were greeted by both the garrison commander and the academy commandant, neither of whom Persephone or Samson had met personally before. The garrison commander was one of those overly anxious, everything needs to be perfect types who set Samson's teeth on edge immediately. The commandant was one of those chunky, jovial guys who lived life without a care in the world, and hardly showed the faintest remnant of guardsman discipline and training. Both saluted and dove into their own spiels over top of one another, a hazard of employing 2 equally ranked colonels in the same building where the only delineation of duties was a chronological passage of their charges from primary education to all things beyond. Samson figured that the only saving grace was that everything was separated by floors, and never the twain shall meet. It was obvious in the first 15 seconds after the salutes dropped and the conversation started that the 2 didn't even work with each other, let alone like each other. They were the bad kind of opposites, not the attracting opposites. These 2 were the type of opposites who were fundamentally opposed in everything from goals to philosophy, with no interest in the other's blathering, both jock-eyed to have their own domain inspected preferentially in a 3-sided conversation directed at him that sounded more to Samson like an L-shaped ambush than ranking officers establishing something as basic as a schedule. What irked him the most was that even junior lieutenants knew that was something the 2 hosts should have worked out in advance of their commanding officer's arrival. They had known he was coming after all. Samson felt his fingers drum impatiently on the hilt of his sword as he considered the inappropriately appealing thought of beating them both senseless. He could feel William and Bryce behind him and Persephone as she stood quietly straight and poised at his side. Major Rasmussen cleared his throat. In his typically blunt and direct fashion, he pointedly reminded them that they had Persephone standing in the middle of a building's top landing pad. They had nothing separating her from a sniper position but a thin ring of home guards and a handful of stationary guardsmen who would not hear the shot until after the projectile had blown her head apart. Samson kicked himself for getting caught up in the petty nonsense. He pointed to the stairs dropping down from the platform and ordered abruptly, "Move this inside. We'll sort things out there." His thumb stroked the hilt of his sword as his fingers drummed during their brief walk across the platform. Persephone slipped her arm into his left, interrupting his fingers, and walked in stride next to him. She spoke softly, "I want to see the school first." He nodded, and that decision was made. "All right." And then he made it happen once they were inside with a snap declaration. They were off to the elevator that would drop them into the depths of the building he had not visited in what felt like centuries. Persephone was entirely too spry for someone suffering a hangover as she asked intelligent and observant questions during their tour. She left him to watch everything from the commandant's demeanor to the shuffle and flow of little things like general maintenance and cleanliness. He used those observations to compare to what he remembered from notes and requisitions, as he looked at the repairs he'd seen on the ground in front of his own eyes. He didn't like to think he was pinching copper in the Academy's oversight, but he definitely wanted to be a good steward of the hegemony's money while ensuring his future guardsmen were trained to exacting standards. With William and Bryce to watch security and a whole squad of armored home guards on their outer perimeter, he was free to pursue his inspection in peace and quiet while half listening to the answers Persephone was extracting. Persephone's hand dropped down his arm, ripped off his sword hilt, interlaced her fingers with his, and clamped her free hand over his. She pulled gently and exclaimed gleefully, breaking him out of his quiet inspection of the physical plant. "Oh, look at them all. Aren't they all just the cutest little things?" She yanked his arm across his body, stopping their procession like a high-speed wreck. As she stepped up to the heavy manual gymnasium door with the full half-light window at the top, she pointed their three interlaced hands at the glass and the massed martial arts training. Her action slammed their tour to a halt so she could spectate. "Samson, look at them all doing their little fighting things together all at the same time. There must be 300 students in that room together. They're adorable." Samson stated more than asked. 4th year, by the forms. He asked the commandant, "Am I correct?" He could have checked his calm for the answer, but he wanted to know what the commandant would say in response. The answer was bland enough. "I believe so, High Commander." Samson made note of the room number and time to check the veracity of the rotund commandant's statement later. Samson asked, "Shall we continue, Commandant?" He answered, "Yes, sir." Persephone interrupted, "No, let's stay and watch them some more." Samson corrected gently, "No, Persephone, we can't stand here pressed to the window all day. We will distract the class. There are already students looking to us instead of their lessons. This is a pass-fail course for their year group. They are dismissed automatically if they can't grasp this class." Modestly surprised, Persephone asked, "That's serious?" The 4 accompanying guardsmen all nodded together that it was that important. "Yes, this is a military academy, not a part of the general education system. At this year group, the instructors don't actively look to disqualify students for martial failure, but if there is clearly no aptitude, they are tutored in the second half of the year. If they are unwilling to apply themselves, they are added to the list of non-academic dismissals for the year, based on the instructor's assessment." Somewhat wistfully, Persephone spoke into the window. I've never had a class anywhere near that big." Samson gently closed his fingers in her hands twice to remind her that they had to be on their way, and she assented by stepping away from the window in the direction they'd been traveling. She changed her position in the conversation by talking to the Commandant again. "All right, Commandant, please continue. I'd like to hear more about the general flow of education and how the facilities are related to student care and support." Samson was a little surprised and leaned back from her to get a good long look at this new person he'd never seen before who was now holding his hand. As they stepped down the hall, she saw him staring and wondered, "What?" Shaking his head at her, "Where did that come from, Persephone?" She defensively fretted for a second, and he could tell she was scheming. Instead, she changed directions of the conversation, and he knew she was covering some scheme. She yanked his hand and shrugged, saying, "I was thinking about all of the creche schools we visited, and, well, I thought about stuff. I just want to know how things work, that's all." Samson let it lay, figuring there was more to it, but that she would tell him when she was ready. All right. Were it not for their late breakfast and periodic snacking on the remainders while they were getting ready, they would have been hungry after her 2.5 hours of methodical grilling, directed at the Commandant. She covered everything from teacher to student ratios to gym and cafeteria requirements, to the size of classrooms and standardized academic testing. Samson didn't have to ask a single question. Persephone beleaguered the Commandant all by herself, with none of his input. She was definitely scheming. She was never that methodical unless she wanted something. When they reached the upper floor of the academy, the garrison commander was waiting, and before they fully arrived the Commandant said his goodbyes. Samson stopped him. With Persephone claiming his hand, he was forced to fumble one-handed while pulling out the Commandant's paperwork. He received it, thanked them, and was gone. Samson made a note to dig into that little tiff later. Not that he was particularly interested, but because he wanted to know about the friction between his subordinates before it exploded in his face someday soon. It was looking like one of those things that had been allowed to metastasize without the steady full-time hand of an active high commander over the Guardsman ranks. Persephone was out of her depth with the military aspects, but was on a roll with the inspection, and when she dove directly into her question and answer routine about things like space per Guardsman and the dining facilities, he let her have it. He took the time to watch the garrison commander's relatively uncomfortable interactions with himself and his fluid and graceful interactions with Persephone, which was odd, to say the least. It smelled like a tactical or strategic political thing that, while Samson could understand because of his junior time and service relative to his high rank, it made no sense given his and Persephone's personal relationship. To Samson, it started to smack of sucking up to the boss's boss in order to take the boss job, while the boss was sleeping with the boss. It just made no sense to Samson, but it was the only logical template that fit the situation as he was seeing it. While the rotund Commandant looked like he was so close to a violation of the Guardsman's height and weight physical fitness standards that he'd bust his uniform bottom's top button if he walked past a buffet at the wrong time of the day. The garrison commander was playing a game that the longer they were in contact put more and more of Samson's neck hair standing on edge. He watched everything carefully, his subordinate included, as they worked their way higher and higher through the Guardsman section of the building. They passed the many floors of medical facilities that worked purposefully on wounded Guardsmen in need of reconstructive surgery from wounds. It was a place Guardsmen were almost all familiar with in their careers. Major Rasmussen had spent months in that same room regrowing his eyes and recovering from his burns after saving Persephone's life. Samson had been there more than once himself. The garrison commander explained politely how the facility was also a modest source of revenue, given the current relatively peaceful state of the hegemony. They had worked through their guardsman patients, while always accepting military patients when bunks were available. The facilities were now accepting some paying civilian patients. The garrison commander had basically offered services on a for-hire basis to the city's insurance groups and private paying customers in order to fill in the available reconstruction nodes and occupy his medical personnel with patient care which would keep them sharp. Samson liked how he was being a good steward of the hegemony's funds and keeping their medical personnel occupied. He definitely didn't like how the garrison commander made it a point to explain to his wife how great a job he was doing, making her so much extra money that no one before had ever thought to do. It smacked strongly of maneuvering for favor. Never mind that in all 3 times Samson had spent there, it had always been packed elbow to elbow with damaged guardsmen in need of repair and horrifically wounded regular military literally stacked in stasis pods along the walls waiting for their turns. Returning soldiers to duty was an extremely high priority for the hegemony military corporations. Trained, skilled, and experienced troops were hard to replace, so they didn't waste them. They certainly did everything they could to repair them. Given that repairs to soldiers were relatively cheap compared to months and sometimes years of specialized training costs, not to mention the morale and experience retention benefits of their forces, fighting that much harder because they knew if there was a chance of survival their fellows would do everything they could to see that they got that chance. This was the first period of general peace lasting more than 6 months that the hegemony had experienced in something close to 175 years. And the man was taking credit for earning a few credits from insurance companies. Samson made another mental note. They made a turn into a familiar corridor, but one Samson rarely visited, preferring other ranges. Persephone exclaimed interestedly, "What is that?" Samson groaned. Their escorting home guard squad stopped and stared between what to their eyes was the most beautiful indoor range complex they'd ever seen in their lives and the piece of siege equipment they vaguely recognized. Both her guardsmen pointed to him and at the same time betrayed him. Asked the high commander. The garrison commander visibly clamped his jaw shut, which Samson again noted in the corner of his eye. Persephone asked quizzically, "Samson, is this what I think it is? What's it doing here?" Samson barked quickly, anxious to be moving along. "It's just a piece of junk applied sciences project from years and years ago." He knew it was coming when she bent down to read the ridiculous plaque that someone had hung on the thing years before he'd even graduated from the academy, resulting in relentless hazing and teasing in his early years as a commissioned guardsman. It was part of the reason he was so damn mean and didn't take crap from anyone, just to get out of the shadow of that thing. She exclaimed, "Awa!" Thrilled, she continued after reading the plaque. "You made this," pointing to the plaque. "This is so sweet. You should read it." He fussed. "I have read it, and it's been quoted to me 1,000,000 times. It's nothing, just a science experiment gone wrong. Just leave that old thing alone, please." She cooed sweetly, "But this is so cool. You were famous, even before you were on vids with me." He grumbled, realizing that she was taking some measure of revenge for waking her. He informed her flatly, "I'm not famous." Persephone persisted in dragging out his embarrassment. She was doing it on purpose, he could tell. He could feel William and Bryce chuckling behind his back. He could see several of the home guard leaning in to read too, as they only pretended to play security. He could see the garrison commander shuffling with irritation to his right before regaining his composure and self-control. He wondered if this was the limits of her playful but inevitable revenge for waking her up, or just the beginning. He answered when Persephone needled. "How did you decide to make this?" Samson took a deep breath and humored her. "It was part of a science class where we had to build a device using principles learned in our class to produce maximum effects on the battlefield. I built a ballista. It was the result of a wager and poor planning on my part. And now it's stuck here because it's too big to move without taking it apart. And too many classes have had fun using it on the range over the years. It will be here until some idiot fires it during that annual insanity, and it explodes into splinters of flying wood and kills people. Until that happens, they'll have too much fun playing with it." The Home Guard squad leader and one of his corporals poked at the thing around its forward arc. They still maintained a respectful distance from Persephone, pretending to secure their perimeter. As soon as the squad leader turned to look at him, Samson knew the question. "Sir, can we please use it?" Knowing it was coming still didn't deaden his decades-old ingrained reaction to the same dumb question. "Sergeant, damn it, no. Ask me that question again, and I'm going to rip your head off with my bare hands and toss it down range." William and Bryce had known that a rote answer was coming since they'd both known and served with Samson for years before his fall, adventures, and return. They both barked their laughter and were struggling to tamp it down when he whipped around to face them. He snapped, "And you two, shut your noise holes. You're still on duty." Samson pointed with his left hand in a rigid knife down the back of the range lanes and stepped off at a marching pace, forcing the rest to follow. "All right, we're moving along now." Persephone captured his left arm and pulled it down to her side. "But it's so cute. And you made it? Can't we stay a little longer?" She was obviously yanking his leg for the fun of it now as she practically skipped beside him. The answer was obvious. "No, we can't stay." Looking down at her smiling up from his side, he gently kissed her forehead while they walked, to lessen the blow and let her know she'd won. He continued mildly, but so he could be heard, "And it's not cute. It's a fearsome engine of wanton destruction and built to slaughter my enemies." She rolled her eyes and said out loud noncommittally, "Oh?" In a private whisper, she warned him, "This isn't over yet. I will see that thing work some day soon." The garrison commander pointedly never looked their way during the whole duration of the exchange. Samson made note of everything as their tour continued. He'd been signing a lot of documents for the Guardsman garrison and recalled as much of it as he could, while walking through the building looking for sporadic items that jumped out at him from those documents. In general, he was very pleased with the maintenance and care of the facilities, the care for the rehabilitating guardsmen in the medical and rehab detachments, and the training of the new guardsmen stationed there. They were on the top floor, and Samson dismissed the garrison commander by handing him his paperwork for the day, and accepted and returned the departing salute. Persephone threw him for a loop when she asked, "Samson, can you please help me look for some vacant buildings that are for sale?" Confused, he almost lost his step, but managed to ask, "Buildings? Can you tell me what you have in mind? Or anything more specific you can tell me to help narrow that down?" She bit her lip, and her eyes flicked up to him and back down with a lightning quickness that told him not only was she scheming, but that she was deep into the planning and nearing the execution phases of her plan. How William and Bryce had missed her blatant tell when she'd escaped from them was absolutely beyond his comprehension. She was like reading a book written for children sometimes. Her statement sounded more like a question. "No, not really. Just a few buildings near the center of the city. I know there've been a few investment groups and owners who've gone bankrupt lately, and, well, I'm thinking about investing." He stopped abruptly. Before she'd realized, she'd gone another step and was yanked around to face him by her attached hand in his. Their forgotten escorts crashed to a halt around them too. He demanded, "What's going on inside that head of yours? Persephone, you're scheming. I can tell. What do you want the building for?" She huffed and rolled her eyes. She always did that when she was irritated that she could not get away clean with whatever it was she was planning. She groused, "I don't want to talk about it yet. It's a secret." He questioned deliberately, "A secret?" She only smiled and nodded her head affirmatively before squeaking, "A secret." At his glare, she rolled her eyes and promised him, "For now, I have a lot more work to do on it before I talk about it with anyone. But I want a building about this size or a little larger." Disbelieving, Samson wondered, "Larger?" She winced slightly at the question and held up her fingers, pinching them close. "Only a little bit larger." He surrendered. "Fine. You win. I'll start looking. I know just the guy to put to work on it. I'll have the list narrowed down to a solid 10 or 20 and let you pick. You're sure you're not going to share this secret yet, so I know what I'm looking for in this mystery search of yours?" She made her little girl don't be mad face and shook her head no. She spoke almost contritely, "A list of 10 to 20 is fine." She snapped out of it, smiled brilliantly, stood on her toes, and kissed his nose. He knew instantly he was not going to like whatever it was she was scheming, since she was already offering apology kisses. She quipped, "Besides, I'm a girl, and I'm cute, and you love me? I'm supposed to have secrets." The 3 remaining guardsmen groaned together. Husband, Major, and Captain were well aware of how her secrets went. Her response to their unanimous reaction looked hilarious, with her mouth hanging slightly open, crestfallen, and painted with the slightly betrayed expression that had slipped out. Samson crossed his hands across her chest to her shoulders, pulled her half a step closer, spun his arms over her head, turning her towards the door held open by a home guard sergeant and stairs to the roof. He gently pushed her forward into motion. "Yeah." Speaking for all 3 of them, Samson continued, "We all know exactly how much fun your secrets can be, Persephone."
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.